Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Senior Vice President, Democracy at GMF, Laura Thornton.
Hi. Good morning, Brussels Forum. I hope everyone's had their coffee and their protein pills, because this morning we're talking about democracy, so buckle up. Actually, every day at GMF is about democracy. Building, defending, advancing democracy and freedom is GMF's North Star. It's our origin and our destination. Democracy is not only a values proposition, but as we see clearly today, it's a matter of our global security, international governance, economic and technological power structures, and order. Our greatest security threats today are at their core about democracy and freedom. It's what our adversaries fear the very most. I don't need to tell anyone here that democracy is not in a great place. We're seeing backsliding across the globe. Meanwhile, autocrats are learning from one another like raptors testing the perimeter, while democracies are slow to align and go on offense. There has been plenty of research and writing about the causes for democracy's decline, including by yours truly. Democracy's failure to deliver, corruption, political finance regimes that give disproportionate political power to the wealthy, growing inequality, the fact that our representative bodies don't actually look like our populations, information disorder. This creates growing lack of trust, but it also creates a vacuum for illiberal populists with simple solutions to complex problems and a boogeyman to blame, to swoop in. So we see not only erosion of faith, but alarmingly, polls show that our publics are increasingly demanding autocratic leadership. In the transatlantic space, we see the gateway drug to autocracy is illiberalism. Majoritarianism and elections while undermining minority rights, undercutting constitution, undercutting checks and balances. And despite Viktor Orban's attempt at branding illiberal democracy, this is an oxymoron, this is nonsense. Strong men, and they're mostly men, they might win that first election democratically and fairly, but then they so thwart the level playing field by undermining equal rights for all, by wiping out civil society, opposition, and media, that no future election is free and fair or democratic. So what is driving this illiberalism? Strong men don't come out of nowhere, right? They're tapping into a demand. And on both sides of the Atlantic, social and values cleavages are the through line connecting democracies in decline. In fact, research shows that the first warning sign that a country is at risk are attacks on women, attacks on LGBTQ, attacks on minorities, attacks on immigrants, attacks on people of color, whether you're in Slovakia, the country Georgia, or the United States. Perhaps fueled by discomfort with the changing demography, an interest to go back to an older time where pecking orders of power and privilege put you at the top. Siren calls for great replacement, Christian nationalism, cultural preservation can be heard from Lyon to Omaha. And interestingly, the first act of ascendant strongmen is often to pass laws like decriminalizing domestic violence, pulling out of the Istanbul Convention, restricting reproductive freedom, codifying heterosexual marriage and attacking immigrants, and then the human rights defenders and civil society and media that support them. There's no clearer example today than my former beloved home of Tbilisi, Georgia. In the last 2 weeks alone, they've gotten rid of gender quotas, with the ruling party MPs saying things about their female counterparts that I could never repeat here. They are trying to criminalize LGBTQ propaganda, and they passed an NGO law that's modeled after the Russian Foreign Agents Act in order to kneecap civil society. But as their prime minister said, it's also to go after liberal ideas. Liberal democracy has been caught a little flat-footed. In many cases, we have surrendered the ideas of patriotism, tradition, religion to the anti-democrats. Why are we doing that? 2 years ago at Brussels Forum, I said the battle for democracy is about hearts as much as minds. Everything we talk about this morning, trust in elections, artificial intelligence, are complicated by the fact that there are many in our society that aren't that interested in evidence, facts, logic, particularly when it butts up against tribe, culture, grievance, and fear. So, how do we find solutions that get at that demand problem, that go deep to where the problem lies? This is GMF's bread and butter. Through civil society, cities, and young leaders, exploring innovations and how to detox from that illiberalism. How do we build out national narratives and communicate and promote democracy in emotional, heartfelt, and even funny ways? Our Ukrainian friends have really shown the way by showing how to build out a national narrative to preempt the garbage coming from Russia about their homeland. We see experiments in citizens' assemblies and deliberative democracy, depolarization and trust-building exercises, online games to build cognitive resistance in youth, local citizen journalism initiatives, and much more. The time for democracy to go on offense has long passed, so let's get to it. We need to get to those hearts. We need to tackle the grievance that's driving people away from the democratic path. And this is going to require democracies to ally the way autocrats do, to share best practice. This is going to require disruption, risk-taking, challenging orthodoxy to test new ideas. This is going to require taking back our national narratives, freedom, tolerance, faith. We've spent a lot of time admiring the problem, and I'm very guilty of that, but now's the time to focus on innovative solutions and the way forward. And there is no better way to do that than listening to people who really have firsthand experience in tackling one of the toughest challenges in democracy, trust in elections. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce 3 election officials, both present and former. Chairperson Amelia Powers-Gardner from the Utah County Commission. Secretary of State of Arizona, Adrian Fontes. And Mr. Sebastian Bay, the former team leader of election security at the Swedish Election Authority, currently with hybrid COE. Please, welcome them. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
So I'm going to put you on the spot first, Chairperson Gardner. In 2022, I became a huge fan of a video that was put out by the 2 governor contestants for the race. And it was a Republican and a Democrat, and they stood on TV and they said, hey, I disagree with him about blah, 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 and I disagree with him, but we both agree and trust our elections. And we will both accept the results of whoever wins. Can you tell me a little bit more? How did this tactic work? Are these preemptive strategies a good way to build trust?
Yeah, I think they are. If you look at Utah, we did some polling, and 89% of our voters have confidence in the results of our elections. That's in 2022, post election denialism, and this is in a Republican state. And the reason why is because our elected officials, whether they're a Republican or a Democrat, from the governor down to the smallest township mayor, have agreed that 99% of them will come and say, we trust our elections and we will stand by the results. And that has really trickled its way down to all of our voters.
And leadership in this case played an important role because it wasn't a partisan issue. You had both governors from both parties.
Right, absolutely. And so, like I said, it's both sides and it's all levels of leadership. One of the things we find is that some people trust their local leaders, their sheriff, their mayor, their commissioner, more than, say, the governor or a presidential candidate. And so having all levels of leadership from the governor to the smallest mayor on the same page and being willing to say that in the course of their campaign has immeasurable results when it comes to voter confidence.
So sticking with 2022, Arizona became a little bit of a ground zero. I remember I was in Maricopa County and election officials were describing, I don't need to tell you, but the threats they received, armed people at drop boxes. But Arizona really quickly jumped into action to build out transparency and to mitigate against threats. Can you talk a little bit about what worked?
Well, generally speaking, what works, I think, and I want to agree with the chairperson over here, is that we are consistent in our storytelling. We have leaders who are willing to step up. And at the end of the day, people are going to listen to their leaders on either side of an issue. And if they're all saying the same thing, then we're going to be in a better place. We're going to be in a good place. And at the county level, particularly in Maricopa County, those folks have been battling this misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation for several years now. It started back in 2018, got really big in 2020, and really in 2022, it actually became a public safety issue. It wasn't just about the elections officials, and it wasn't just about our workers at our warehouse and some of the other places where, armed folks showed up. Now it's out there in the streets, and now it's out there in the public. And so the coordinated effort to put a cap on that really was one of the success stories that we had in 2022. There were some other things that we probably could have done a little bit better, like explaining the facts about some of the processes that actually worked exactly as they were planned, because we've got redundancies. Election administrators across the globe have redundancies in case something goes wrong. There was an example in one of the Utah towns where there was a fire and 30,000 people had to evacuate. Well, they had redundancies in place, including in cooperation with surrounding jurisdictions. We have the same types of things in Arizona. I'm sure they do elsewhere. You've got to make that happen. And so we plan very well for these things. Now we have to plan even better for our communications, which isn't something that elections administrators across the globe have had to deal with very much in the past. It's a new part of our culture. So safety and communication are really important now for election administrators.
And I want to bring Sebastian in, but on this issue of communications, one thing I was thinking, where there were efforts to communicate about the quality of the elections in the United States, did you get the sense that perhaps oftentimes this was communicated as nothing ever goes wrong? Elections are perfect in the United States, rather than saying, hey, look, they're always, and in a way, did we socialize people to be prepared for there's going to be a few mistakes? That doesn't mean that the elections weren't legitimate. Do you think that we need to do better at alerting people that things are not perfect in elections?
Those are parts of the storytelling that we do as election administrators. This is a human endeavor,
right, and
humans are imperfect. There are always going to be some small issues. The question is whether or not we can attack the issue rhetorically and make sure that it stays as the small issue. We include the redundancies and the safeties that we've got in each of our different systems. That, to me, is the important thing that we really need to focus more on.
Yeah, I came to government from the manufacturing sector. I came from the global leader in diesel engines and construction and mining equipment from Caterpillar. I spent 12 years at Caterpillar. And I always tell people, Caterpillar's the global leader and they build the best equipment in the world, but it fails. That's why I was a continuous product improvement engineer. That was my job, is to take products in the field when they failed, figure out why they failed, and fix it. Elections are no different. They're not going to be perfect.
That's right.
But what we need to do is run the best job we can, and when we do find an issue, we have contingencies, and then we investigate to see if an issue would have affected the outcome of the election.
That's right, yeah.
That's the key. If it wouldn't have affected the outcome of the election, then we fix it for the future. We fix it in the process. But we don't blow up the system. And I think the more people understand that, the better we're going to be. If we come and say, as election officials, if we circle the wagons and say elections are perfect,
yeah,
then they're going to find a flaw and say, look, they're liars. We can't trust them. Instead, we need to look at this and say, we're all in this together. We're going to do the best job we can. If you have an idea for improvement, bring it to me, and I'll implement it. In the meantime, let's get the best election we can have.
That's so true. Now, Sebastian, I don't want to put you on the spot as Sweden is the best thing ever. Help us, please. But you have had success in government intervention to build trust and counter disinformation. In the US, this is very fraught, right? They're presumed as partisan. So how can governments successfully be involved in building trust without giving the impression of censoring speech or advantaging one candidate over another? Tell us a little bit about what you've accomplished.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it is, of course, always extremely challenged to try to move our experiences into different political contexts.
Help us, please.
If we just look at trust in elections, and the strength of the Swedish election system is that it's based on a consensus-based models. No changes are ever done to the election law without every single politician in parliament signing up. We make decisions by consensus, which means that there's broad political support for the election system in itself. And with election system, it's of course not just running the election, it is the legal processes around it as well. And it is the right to appeal election should there be problems. And like you say, there often are problems. And if those problems affect the outcome, then we have a rerun of the election. It's that simple, right? So in Sweden, we've often taken a whole of society approach, trying to include not just the political system or the civil servants or the agencies, but the society as a whole. And when we started after the US experiences in 2016 and trying to increase our own resilience, primarily against interference from state actors in other countries, we started not just by protecting the elections, by reaching out to media, to journalists themselves, to the politicians, trying to educate on how our elections run. We talked a lot about, how do you counter when things have gone wrong? Well, you need to vaccinate ahead of time. So we've spent a lot of effort on education. And I think that's so centered to election protection, because it's a very complicated system. You will not find many people in your own country that can accurately describe how elections are run. It's a complex system, which means that we need to inform people, journalists, extremely important, but also politicians, and reach out to them when things start to heat up, so that we can vaccinate, preempt, and make sure that these things don't break out of control. So we've had a lot of focus on that when it comes to election protection.
I'd like to underscore something you said. You're so wise when you talk about really educating people about the election, including politicians. I had run campaigns before. I had run congressional campaigns. I myself ran a successful campaign. I had no clue how to run an election until I became an election administrator. A lot of the media, they call people election experts that are campaign experts. Those are two very different things. And a lot of elected officials, legislators, they feel like they know how to run elections because they were a candidate in an election. It's a very different ballgame. One of the things that I did that helped my community have confidence today was prior to 2020, we opened up our ballot center. I literally had our public works cut holes in the walls and install windows so that anybody walking by could see everything we did. We put cameras in the ballot center and we projected them onto 50-inch televisions in the lobby so people could see what we were doing. This was prior to 2020. During the year when a politician isn't on the ballot, we ask them to come in and volunteer in our ballot centers so they can learn how these processes work. That way, when a concerned citizen calls them, they can say, oh, no, I've been there, I've done that, and I understand. You should go see too. We did tours opened for the public. We did media tours. This was all leading up to 2020. And so our people were inoculated against these things. These are processes that I adopted by watching people like Sebastian. We can learn from each other all over the transatlantic region and say, what are you doing that works?
Right.
And how can I do that too?
Well, you touch upon something really important, because both of you, that involving people in the process. So I spent many decades observing elections overseas. And I think once you're actually in the room watching things, it's actually just really boring, right? You know what I mean? And like just, but that's in a way
We think
so
it's very
reassuring,
exciting.
right?
Well, maybe
Make
for you.
elections boring
Like,
again.
Yeah.
Not for you guys, but no. But what I'm saying is that you think it's all this subterfuge and all the, and you have all the, maybe you come with preconceived notions, but when you're actually sitting there and watching the process and how it works.
Right, and this is part of what my colleagues here are talking about, sort of this inoculation, this pre-planning. We're doing a lot of that, and we do it as elections officials. We have disaster planning sessions, like tabletop exercises that law enforcement and the military do, where we run through scenarios. This year, we're going to be offering one to the media on May 9th, because we want our partners in the media, who are our chief communicating partners, to be able to be speaking from the same glossary of terms. If something happens, one of the biggest challenges that we have is trying to explain to members of the media how the entire context of this very complex process contains that one issue. And so if we've got that pre-explanation out there and they've already been through an exercise where they understand the people, the players, and the process, they can much more easily get to the point and then get out the story that's going to speak to whatever the issue may be, and not be asking all kinds of extra questions that really aren't necessary, and in asking those questions then raise more doubt. I had an interview with a member of the media, I will say, and he asked me sort of the general question that we've got here. He says, how do you build trust and confidence in elections? And I said, well,
Help us.
we've already done our job. I said 2 weeks ago, Arizona had its presidential primary election, and we didn't have any issues at all. Not a single issue across the entire state, and not a headline either. Not a story was told about the success, about the human beings, the people, our neighbors, our friends who are actually running the elections, doing a great job. And so we can do everything that we can. But as you indicated, Sebastian, we've got to get everybody involved in this process. The leadership has to be speaking to it. The media has to be speaking to it. Because liberal democracy requires all of our pillars, all of our institutions to be cooperating together for its own preservation. We know what the alternative is.
You make a great point about really talking about who's running the election. You talked about, let's look at these faces. In the United States, all elections are run locally. They're all run at the county level. And so when I talk to the media and when I talk to other elected officials and the citizens, I humanize that. I tell the names. I tell them, this is Roseanne, who's been running elections for 20 years. And this is Carly, who's worked in that office since the day she graduated from high school. And this is Sherry, a mother of 7 and a grandmother of 14. And you're talking about Tony, who just got married. And I use the names of my staff, and I talk about them. And I say, when you say that the election is fixed, you're maligning them. And these people are your neighbors. They're the people you see at the grocery store, and your children go to school with their children. And they love this community just as much as you do.
Have you experienced a problem with retaining election officials? Because we've heard multiple stories about that, but then I've also heard that it's moving in a more positive direction as of late. How do you build that sort of desire for people to volunteer and become involved?
Well, that's one of the most interesting things about the place that we're working in right now. In Arizona, we've lost a senior election official in 12 of our 15 counties. That impacts 98% of our voters. And that's difficult when you lose that much institutional experience. And the reasons they're leaving are sometimes really disturbing because of threats and things of this nature. But at the end of the day, the people that are coming in and those folks that are moving into these spots are coming in clear-eyed. They understand the value of the work that they're doing. And like you said, I also have a lot of hope. We're adjusting our training to make sure that we can stick to the fundamental practice of what's going on. We're making our folks aware of the new threats through emergent generative artificial intelligence and some of the other issues that we might have to deal with, so that they can understand in context how to initially deal with this. But we're focusing on the fundamentals. And that's really what's important for the new folks that are coming in. And they get it. They understand it. And I think we should be very hopeful. When it's always darkest before the light, and the threat is real. But at the end of the day, it's these folks that we depend on. Not those of us at the higher state level office, the folks who are actually in the trenches, out there in the polling places, those people who are there for a season, maybe a couple weeks, maybe just a couple of days, they're the ones that are doing really good work. They continue to do really good work. And I have hope because I have faith in them.
Yeah. So, Sebastian, Sweden is, as you mentioned, on the front lines of a lot of foreign interference, and you have worked really hard to build your defenses through this whole of society approach. Arguably, 2024, there's never been a greater incentive for Russia to interfere in our elections with Ukraine, and it's an existential threat for them. What are some successful ways to inoculate civil society or prepare civil society for Russian interference in the information space, in the campaign space, and even in, digging their way into very local political issues? How has that worked?
I think the approaches you mentioned as well, and underscoring that elections are run by the entire society. In Sweden, a country of 10 million, more than 50,000 people volunteer to work for elections. And that is also our strength, and we need to use that strength because it means that 50,000 people have hands-on experience running elections. So they are, of course, our primary frontline. They are our primary defense against disinformation. And we need to utilize them. We need to use all these people that have experiences from running elections. That said, we face significant adversaries with significant resources, especially when it comes to cyber interference. And state actors will try to create vulnerabilities. They will try to make our elections fail. One of the least told stories, but most important stories of the Russian interference in the 2016 election isn't Russia trying to interfere with who's winning the election. It is the significant attempts to hack, interfere with, and undermine US election infrastructure. And we've seen that in Sweden as well. We've faced significant cyber attacks in the last 3 elections. So this is one of the problems that we really need to prepare. And one of the ways we can prepare is, of course, not just having redundancies and plans and making sure that we can counter attacks, but it's about talking about these things that can happen so that the public are aware ahead of time that this might happen, and this is how we will rectify it. But my experience is that we're still not dedicating enough resources to be able to counter this very significant threat, not just from state actors, but also from domestic actors who are now increasingly, we're not seeing direct cooperation, but state actors, especially Russia, Iran, China, they love to leverage our flaws, which means that they love to provide ammunition to domestic actors.
One of the interesting things that you bring up is sort of this notion of resources. In 2017, the United States of America and the Department of Homeland Security declared elections administration as critical infrastructure. It remains the only portion of American critical infrastructure with no sustained federal funding. And in many states, we really don't get the resources that we need because the folks who are making those sorts of budgeting determinations only see it as a once every couple of years exercise. And the reality, as we all know, is that elections run 24/7, 365 days a year to get to that point. And so making sure that we're properly resourced, even at the local level, at the state level, and really we need that federal help, is important. But even then, we can call on all kinds of other resources that are available. We actually use Arizona's National Guard every single day to protect against foreign interference and foreign, sort of the probing that we have into our election systems. The Arizona Counterterrorism Information Center is another great partner that we have, along with our state and federal departments of Homeland Security. So really coordinating all of these efforts and making sure that we have a complete infrastructure that's prepared to defray any of those sort of attempts at penetration of our systems is another critical piece. But the resource battle is one that I think all aspects of government really need to prioritize. But budgets reflecting values also means that folks who are really talking a lot about election integrity, talking a lot about election infrastructure, they need to put their money where their mouth is.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. In fact, that's what I noticed of what you said as well, is this idea of the resources. You think of funding your military and people They see a jet fly overhead, and they see that as something that protects them. And same with your police force or your first responders or firemen, and you see that, and you see sirens as a vehicle goes by, and you think, oh, that's what my tax dollars go to. Yeah. But the elections. The best elections are the ones that we don't hear about.
Right.
And because we don't hear about them, getting funding for them is very difficult. That goes from the equipment all the way through to the pay that we give the election administrators. We've had 56% turnover in our election administrators in the state of Utah. I think Arizona and Utah have it worse than maybe other national trends. And you can't replace good people for the wage that they're making. I took a 60% pay cut when I became an election administrator. Over half my wage went away when I became an election administrator. No, there aren't that many people that are as insane as I am when it comes to protecting
thank
liberties.
You. We have a few minutes left, so I'd love to take some questions from the audience. I'll just gather a few, and then we'll do a quick rapid fire. Are there any questions?
There's one.
Over here, Sandra. Let's get her a mic. Thank you.
Yes, I'm just wondering how possible it would be for codes of conduct and some agreements from all candidates in advance. I know they're trying this in the EU area and having candidates agree not to use AI, for example, and deepfakes, etc. But how possible would it be to do that? Because there are already themes in the media already saying that the elections are going to be stolen. So how do you stop that now?
Excellent question.
Yeah, the Jimmy Carter Center in the state of Georgia in the United States has actually done that. They did a great job with candidates in the state of Georgia, getting them to sign basically a compact that said, when the results come out, I will agree with the results, very similar to what we did in Utah with the governors. I don't know if we could require it to run for office, but public pressure can do a lot of good in that area.
And I think it's extremely important that we find a political solution to many of these problems, because they are political. So if that's having candidates signed up or making sure that there's consensus around election law, that is, of course, what we need to start with. If we don't achieve that, we as election administrators have such a much harder task ahead of us, because then we constantly need to fight the political system who are challenging the elections, and we don't want that.
And even if it's not enforceable, it's something citizens and media can hold to account. Like you said, you were going to agree to this, and what do you think about codes of conduct?
Well, I think they're useful, but honor is honor, and your code of conduct is only as enforceable as it is. And our First Amendment would probably prevent any significant enforcement of that, particularly if a legal challenge that is legitimate arises at some stage. So we really do have to look to the political pressure, the political question, and folks just need to learn to behave better, right? Let's figure out a way to get rid of the sore loserism, because that's really the root of this whole problem.
And it's contagious.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, I lost, therefore it was stolen.
Right.
If there there's a question back there. One last question.
Good morning, Pavel Havlicek from Association for International Affairs, Prague-based think tank. I wanted to ask our American colleagues especially about how you approach the topic and discussion with the social media platforms, because we know how influential these are actually in influencing elections, potentially also allowing for interference that we have seen in the past as well. There is a big push on the side of the EU. Yesterday we had the Czech Euro Commissioner Věra Jourová that is spearheading the efforts on this on the EU side. So how do you approach this from the state level in the United States, and which channels do you have to interact with platforms? Thank you.
Well, first and foremost, I think the regulation of these sorts of platforms is going to end up being a congressional thing. We can't do it at the state level with any sort of effect. There's too many states. We'd have to have some national approach. But I would say to the social media companies, think about your business model. If your business model is only based on your quarterly profits, which is where sort of this, click-o-rama is coming from, you've got a problem. In a free society, you're going to be able to do what you want. But we already have calls in many societies and in authoritarian places where those social media platforms can't exist. And so what I would do is I would say, hey, social media platforms, if you want to preserve and protect your capacity to make money, if you want to preserve and protect your capacity to have opportunity and engage in the overall economy, do it in a place that is a free democracy, and help preserve and protect that democracy with appropriate regulation about truth when it comes to the function and process that makes that democracy real. Otherwise, it's a very short-term view just to allow all of this nonsense to continue to proliferate when you know that it's not true.
Yeah, I think another part of that is that we have to be proactive. Traditionally, election administrators kind of kept their head down, they stared at their own shoes, and they did their work. And they were hesitant to talk to the media. Most of them are not politicians. And we have to kind of reverse that trend and engage, but this includes with social media. We need to start using things like artificial intelligence to be constantly skimming the social media accounts of our community and proactively looking for mis and dis and malinformation so that we can go and then correct that information. In 2020, I felt like I was playing whack-a-mole, and literally it was just people tagging me in posts. There would be this misinformation that was coming through, and someone would tag me, and I could go through and read the thread, and then I could correct it. At one point during the 2020 election, though, oddly enough, every Republican who worked in my office, our social media accounts got restricted, including mine. But every Democrat that worked in our office, theirs wasn't. So there was about a 3-day period of time where I would get tagged in a post. I couldn't respond to it, so I would have to find one of my employees that was a Democrat that could then respond to this post because I couldn't reply. We had to get a member of the United States Senate involved to get Facebook, Meta, to unrestrict all the Republicans. I mean, I was the chief elections official and I couldn't reply to information. So asking the platforms to do it can be problematic based on politics, but we can utilize technology to proactively seek out bad information and fix it.
And flood the zone.
And flood
with
the zone.
the good information.
Right.
I just want to say that even though I've often been critical of the social media companies, when it comes to engagement from the election administration in Europe, I think we've had a lot of success when it comes to removing disinformation about the conduct of elections. But one of the ways we can help the social media companies is through legislation. In Sweden, it is illegal to spread disinformation about the conduct of election that tries to interfere with the election, which means that we have a very solid legal basis of approaching the social media companies and say, this post, which aims at disenfranchising voters, it is illegal. You have to remove it. So if there is a firm legal basis for interaction with them, it also makes it so much easier. So we need to look at that. And I think it's not so controversial when it comes to this very narrow issue of disinformation about the conduct of elections. And we should focus on that. And then once we have that figured out, then we can address the rest of these more problematic issues.
So we're in the countdown. I want to do rapid fire really quickly. What gives you hope about elections in 2024?
That we've come so far in the last years. We are so much better prepared now.
I would say that the public is getting to the point that they want to engage, right? They want to learn more, they want to learn. And the more knowledge they have, that knowledge is power. And I think we should give them that knowledge.
It's the election administrators themselves, the nameless, faceless masses who actually run our elections, and they keep coming back year in, year out, in spite of the threats, in spite of the long hours, in spite of the low pay, because they understand the value of the work that they do to the voters that they serve. That's what gives me hope.
Amen. All right. Warm applause for our guests this morning. Thank you.